I'm Elena Sokova, the Executive Director of the Vienna Center for Disarmament and Non-Proliferation. And on behalf of the Center, I'm very pleased to welcome you today to our webinar. This is a topic that is very timely. We know that last Friday, January 22nd, the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, or TPNW, entered into force. It is the first international treaty that prohibits possession, use, and stationing of nuclear weapons, along with other activities, challenging the legitimacy of nuclear deterrence. While the majority of non-nuclear weapon states support the treaty, nuclear weapon states and their allies continue to oppose it. With the entry into force, a number of important questions arise, including about its impact on nuclear disarmament and the international non-proliferation regime. First and foremost, what does the entry into force change in terms of the TPNW's normative standing? How might the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Entry and Nuclear Weapons entry into force affect the debate at the 10th NPT Review Conference? Some analysts have argued that European countries are more susceptible to pressure to join the treaty, largely due to domestic political factors. How the relationship between the TPNW and NATO states, particularly in Western Europe, is likely to develop in the next 5-10 years. And also, after the treaty's entry into force, what steps do states need to take, especially in preparation for the first meeting of state parties to be held 1 year from the entry into force? And today we have a stellar panel to discuss these issues. First and foremost, Ambassador Alexander Kmentt, Director of Disarmament, Arms Control and Non-Proliferation Department at the Federal Ministry of the Republic of Austria for European and International Affairs, one of the architects and catalysts of the initiative on the humanitarian impact of nuclear weapons and the negotiations of the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. Alexander, welcome back to Vienna. Dr. Heather Williams, who is currently Stanton Nuclear Security Fellows, but at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, but who is also a senior lecturer at the King's College London. She is also Senior Associate Fellow at the European Leadership Network and serves on the Wilton Park Advisory Council and many others. She's a well-recognized expert and one of few academics who does not shy away from writing about the views and positions of nuclear weapon states and their allies, particularly NATO members. And our own Gaukhar who directs a program on international organizations and non-proliferation regime at the VCDNP, and who is also well known for her expertise on both the TPNW and the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, and is often approached by governments, international, governmental, and non-governmental organizations to provide counsel and analysis on nuclear disarmament and all things related to the NPT. Before we jump into the discussion, a few notes about technical issues. We will be using Q&A functions for questions to the panelists. And those of you watching on YouTube, you could submit your questions via email to events@vcdnp.org. You can submit them during the presentations or after the presentation. And also a note to everyone that the webinar is being recorded. Without further ado, it's my pleasure to give the floor to our first speaker, Alexander. Please, the microphone is yours.
Thank you so much. Thank you for the kind introduction, for the invitation, and for the welcoming me back to Vienna, and for the opportunity to talk about one of my favorite topics. So you've asked us to address some of the questions that you mentioned. I'll start with why the TPNW is important and what its impact on the regime is going to be, in my view. First of all, I think it's a historical achievement, a milestone. As you said, it's the first time that there is a comprehensive prohibition expressly prohibiting nuclear weapons in a global treaty. It's also historic by what the treaty represents and how it was achieved. I think it's a paradigm shift because the focus is on the weapon itself and not on who should have it and who should not. It's the unacceptable consequences and the uncontrollable risks of nuclear weapons and of the policy of nuclear deterrence that are the underlying rationale of the TPNW, basically enacting what Ban Ki-moon said in 2013 when he said there are no right hands that can handle the wrong weapons. Looking more closely at the breadth of humanitarian consequences and risks led a majority of states to the inescapable conclusion that these weapons ought to be prohibited and delegitimized given the overall stagnation in multilateral nuclear disarmament. It's also important because the TPNW was negotiated through the General Assembly, which is the most democratic international forum. It represents also a sort of democratic shift in the nuclear weapons discourse. I think non-nuclear weapon states were no longer ready or are no longer ready to accept these weapons, and the global threat that they represent are dealt with in non-inclusive and undemocratic ways because it's an issue, a concern for all humanity, which is also an underlying rationale of the TPNW. It's also important because it clarifies, in my view, that the majority of states considers the nuclear status quo and the lack of progress in nuclear disarmament is no longer legitimate. The promises and the commitments under Article 6 have not been implemented sufficiently, and there are no indications that nuclear armed states have a plan or a concrete vision of how they will be able to move away from reliance of nuclear weapons. And then the treaty is important because it raises the question of what responsible policies are and whether the persistent reliance on nuclear deterrence can be considered a responsible and sustainable policy for collective security. Impact, of course, will depend. It's one of the most highly contested areas in international relations, but I'm optimistic that the normative pressure of the TPNW and the more inclusive and informed societal debate that I think will facilitate, will bring about change. I see universalization of the treaty in a sort of broader sense, of course, to increase the number of countries that will be legally bound by the treaty, but also it's also bringing the compelling arguments and the underlying rationale of the TPNW into the public discourse in countries that currently oppose it. And I think here the role of an informed citizenry and civil society will be critical. So second question was what changes with the entry into force of the TPNW's normative standing and impact, and how it might affect the NPT review conference. What it changes is that the TPNW is now a reality in international law. It's an integral part of the disarmament, arms control and non-proliferation architecture. It cannot be ignored. States are free to join or not join the treaty, but the attempts that we've seen to ignore the treaty, to belittle it or to undermine it, and its supporters, I must add, that it's necessary to get away from that into a more constructive discourse, and I hope the entry into force will help for that. For the NPT review conference, it's of course not me to say what will happen, but I would assume that TPNW states parties will underscore the complementarity of the TPNW and the NPT, that they will want to seek a factual acknowledgement about the TPNW, which could of course clarify that not everybody is supportive of it. that is not beyond the diplomatic skill of participants at the NPT to find such a formulation. I also expect that the supporters of the TPNW will want to highlight the humanitarian consequences of these weapons and the risks associated with nuclear weapons, both strategic risks and nuclear risks, and will also want to highlight international humanitarian law. And again, I think none of this is impossible to achieve. And other than that, unfortunately, I expect the usual nuclear disarmament discussion at the NPT, in which nuclear weapon states usually push back on accepting too concrete or actions with concrete timelines. And we've seen in the past very often such vague language in NPT outcome documents, which have led to little in terms of implementation of Article 6. Then on your question on the European countries, whether they're more susceptible to join the TPNW and the relationship between TPNW and NATO, I think European countries are more susceptible because the population in all European countries is clearly in favor of eliminating nuclear weapons. And in fact, there's also clear majority to join the TPNW. There is, and I hope there will be, a more open, a more inclusive and more democratic discourse in European states than what one might expect on this issue in autocratic states. And that, of course, is a good thing. And it's a characteristic of democracies, and it's as such not related to the nuclear weapons issue. I mean, we also see more debate on other global issues like human rights or climate change. So I think change on nuclear weapons, if it is to come, I think it's more likely to come from the strength of an inclusive and democratic discourse in democratic countries. I'm convinced that the more people are informed about the consequences and risks of nuclear weapons and of nuclear deterrence, the more the edifice of nuclear deterrence will start to crumble. In addition to the consequences, I think specifically the risks and vulnerabilities stemming from new technologies, from cyber, from artificial intelligence, or from hypersonic weapons, is already, but will continue to create more and more uneasiness. It's not easy, of course, it will not be easy and it will take time, but I think deep at heart, the proponents of nuclear deterrence also know that they cannot keep the lid on this forever, neither on the proliferation nor on the cognitive dissonance of saying that one wants to achieve a world of nuclear weapons without actually being able to take really transformative steps towards this goal. NATO states may wish to consider some steps short of joining the treaty. I think one thing would be to possibly acknowledge the threat perceptions of the rest of the world stemming from the possession of nuclear weapons and the policy of nuclear deterrence. Could clearly define that they also wish to get away from reliance on nuclear weapons and nuclear deterrence. And this could be formulated as a clear policy goal coupled with concrete steps within NATO to develop alternative forms of nuclear deterrence, to move away from nuclear deterrence. Because NATO membership, at least in my understanding, is not depending on participation in its nuclear policies. It's a political choice, as far as I understand it. So they could, on their own or collectively, define such a policy goal, which I think would be considered as a very good sign from the TPNW perspective, and could be a good start of a more constructive and more inclusive and more democratic discourse on this issue. So I think the TPNW will play a crucial role. At the end of the day, states do not want to engage in practices that are viewed as unlawful and illegitimate by most others. I strongly believe in the power of international law and the transformative effect of norms. Of course, it's a gradual process and it's a discursive process, but here I think the TPNW is really a milestone and a paradigm shift. And I think I exceeded my time. So thank you very much for this opportunity.
Thank you very much, Alexander. I will return to some of the points, I'm sure, in the discussion. But in the meantime, Heather, why don't I give you the floor to you?
Great, thank you, Elena. Thank you, Alexander and Gaukhar. It's great to see you both. And yeah, thanks for the invitation to VCDNP to present today. I've been asked to focus my comments on the relationship between NATO and the TPNW over the next 10 years. So I'll start with some observations about NATO and TPNW interactions to date, some questions that I think TPNW states parties can resolve and address in their first meetings with regards to NATO, and then some ideas for the way ahead. But first, just to get us started, the relationship between NATO and the TPNW has been tense because of these different views on deterrence and extended deterrence, as Alexander outlined. NATO is not simply an alliance that includes nuclear armed states. It's a nuclear alliance, meaning that nuclear deterrence is essential to the security of its members and always has been. Therefore, the TPNW's prohibition on threats to use nuclear weapons, i.e. deterrence, is perceived by many NATO members as an attempt to undermine the foundation of their security. This tension isn't going away. However, I also don't think the tension is particularly helpful or sustainable. So now that the TPNW has entered into force, I want to invite every one of you on this call to think ahead. What do you want the relationship between the TPNW and NATO to look like in 10 years' time? How do we envision these two institutions living side by side in a decade's time, whereby if it is still a nuclear NATO and a fully implemented TPNW? But just to quickly kind of run through the interaction between the TPNW members and NATO to date. So NATO's position on nuclear weapons, it is quite clear. It will remain a nuclear alliance for as long as nuclear weapons exist. Nuclear weapons are the foundation of NATO's security and have been since the alliance was founded. And NATO opposes the TPNW because it does not reflect the security environment. NATO members believe that the alliance creates a more safe and secure Europe, underpinned by alliance unity and by nuclear deterrence. So I don't think that we should expect any major changes to that position unless we see changes in the security environment. To be blunt about it, when NATO members say that it will remain a nuclear alliance, I think that we should and we have to take them at their word on that. Several NATO allies have domestic debates about the salience of nuclear deterrence today, and NATO as an alliance has articulated a position that a world without nuclear weapons is its desired end state. But even if those governments with domestic debates do still support, even those governments with the domestic debates, they do still support NATO remaining a nuclear alliance, and they have consistently signed up to these consensus statements, and that's for both deterrence and assurance purposes. So that's where we are today. The obvious question is, where are we going to go from here? I see three options. The first option is we can just continue with the status quo, with NATO and the TPNW at odds, throwing barbs at each other. But as I said, I don't think this is helpful or sustainable. The second option would be to see a fundamental change within NATO. And to be clear, I do think this would be a fundamental change. But for the reasons that I just stated, I think it's highly unlikely that we will see this because of the security environment and because of the continued reliance on nuclear deterrence for many NATO members. But also, if a fundamental change within NATO creates new security challenges or if it's destabilizing, I don't think anybody wants to see that, including TPNW members. So that brings us to option three, which, as you can probably guess, is the one that I would like us to work towards, which is some sort of peaceful coexistence, where these two organizations can live side by side. I think that this is a worthy goal to work towards for the next 10 years. However, there are just a few questions that I think the TPNW states parties can start helping to resolve to help us get to that point. So the questions for the TPNW states parties, the first is the relationship with the NPT. I'm quite hopeful that this can be resolved once and for all at the NPT review conference, which would be prior to the meeting of states parties. But I'm hopeful that the final document will include some compromise language acknowledging the entry into force of the TPNW as Alexander outlined. I think that that's a realistic goal that we can work towards. I did see Oliver Meyer's tweet about a study done by the German Bundestag that said that the NPT and the TPNW were complementary, but obviously there are other studies that are saying the opposite, such as a recent strategic update by the French MOD. So you have two NATO members who seem to have different interpretations of the relationship between the TPNW and NPT, which is maybe normal. But Frankly, I find it really helpful to hear from TPNW members and policymakers such as Alexander, who have stated unequivocally that the TPNW is not meant to undermine the NPT in any way. It is not a substitute for the NPT. And also, it's really helpful to hear that TPNW members see the treaty as contributing to their Article 6 commitments. I think that's a really on point and helpful message. Statements to the contrary or suggesting that states leave the NPT do not help the TPNW's cause. Other things that states parties can address will be these practical questions that I think can contribute to the credibility of the treaty over time. That includes verification questions, and I saw in the Q&A somebody already raised this. These concerns have been voiced elsewhere. But then also questions about how the TPNW will handle questions of compliance, such as Kazakhstan and Palau, which I've written about elsewhere. But again, these are kind of more general questions that will take time to work through, and I think that's fine. However, it will help determine the credibility and influence of the membership of the TPNW. And so then this brings us to the other question that the state parties can address, which is the relationship with nuclear alliance. Would TPNW members be open to collaborating with NATO or NATO members on risk reduction measures, for example? Or would this be considered assisting in a nuclear alliance? I have been told that assistance is well defined in international law, and I'm sure that it is. It would just be helpful to hear TPNW members explain what that means in the context of the treaty and its relationship with NATO. To give a concrete example here, in August of 2020, NATO conducted mission Allied Sky, which involved flying B-52s, not nuclear armed, but flying B-52s over all NATO members. This was for training and readiness purposes, but it was also a symbol of alliance unity and nuclear signaling. If a NATO partner wanted to participate in this exercise, if NATO requested overflight of a partner, would that be considered assistance, and would it potentially be a violation of the TPNW? It's these nitty-gritty little questions that I think would be helpful for states parties and the TPNW to start teasing out to offer their interpretation of where do they draw the line on assistance. So what is the way ahead here? There are some major upcoming milestones. Obviously, the NPT review conference. There are also going to be elections in some NATO member states that might change national positions on nuclear weapons. Some of these might be more open to engaging with the TPNW, but there also might be some that become more hardline and want to see NATO take a stronger nuclear stance. So we need to be prepared for that as well. There will also be a new NATO strategic concept and a nuclear doctrine in the coming years. So these are just some things to watch. If a TPNW does attempt to undermine nuclear deterrence and NATO members believe that nuclear deterrence underpins their security, this is just going to continue to be a tense relationship. Specifically, many NATO members will want to continue to state their opposition to the TPNW so as to be a persistent objector under international law. Going forward, I think we just have to be honest and frank about this challenge. And then just a final observation. I am really looking forward to the first meeting of states parties of the TPNW so that we can hear more official positions and official interpretations about the TPNW. NGOs, including myself, we've been doing a lot of speculating, a lot of talking about what the TPNW might do, how it might interpret this, what this might mean. And I just think that finally hearing more from the treaty's members, now that it's entered into force, that's going to provide a lot of clarity, I hope, for the treaty going forward and its relationship with NATO in particular. But just to close, because of the security environment and NATO's emphasis on unity, I don't think that we should expect to see a major change in NATO's position on the TPNW in the near future. Therefore, we do have to ask ourselves, what are visions for the future that involve both an active TPNW and a nuclear NATO? And with that, I'll wrap up and look forward to hearing others' thoughts.
Thank you, Gerda, very much. Just a quick reminder for those of you who are watching us to submit your questions in the Q&A function rather than chat. Yeah, I think we'll probably have a kind of several questions, and people already raised that, and discussion about the first meeting of the state parties. I think that's one of the issues that people already mentioned as of interest. And Gaukhar, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Elena. Thank you to Alexander and Heather. I will be brief, I think, because a lot of ground has been covered already on the questions you posed. And I will begin by agreeing that the entry into force of the TPNW is certainly a significant development. And I see it as a manifestation of one of the two rather widely divergent trends that we've seen in recent years. Because on the one hand, we've seen a recommitment to nuclear weapons by nuclear weapon states and their allies in the past decade or so as guarantors of security. And the rise of argument that conditions for nuclear disarmament are not only here, but are actually getting worse because of the deteriorating international security environment. And that's one trend, and Heather covered a lot of that by talking about the NATO states' perspective on the role of nuclear weapons in their security. On the other hand, we've seen over the past decade a quest by many non-nuclear weapon states for empowerment, for reclaiming their place in the nuclear weapons debate, and saying that they have an equal stake in this rather than being sort of spectators begging for progress every 5 years at the NPT Review Conference. And of course, the TPNW signifies the continuation of the rise of humanitarian approach to disarmament writ large, not only limited to nuclear weapons, but other categories of weapons. And the TPNW is clearly a product of the humanitarian initiative that sought to reframe the debate on nuclear weapons from the state security centric, from the international stability centric, which we've seen for decades in the NPT context, to the one focused on human security and the impact of nuclear weapons on people and environment and climate. And so where the first trend, again, emphasized the role of nuclear weapons as security instruments, the second, the humanitarian trend, emphasized the risks posed by nuclear weapons and their inhumane nature. And now that the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons is in force, it is international law, as Alexander said, and formally part of the regime that was built around the Non-Proliferation Treaty. And the two treaties, I see them as legally compatible. They're not in contradiction. And the TPNW was meant specifically to advance the implementation of Article 6 of the NPT and designed to be a part of this very international regime that was created around the NPT. But at the same time, the Ban Treaty's very premise is a challenge to the status quo that has formed in that international regime. So over the years in the NPT context, the narrative developed suggesting that while disarmament remains the ultimate goal, nuclear weapons are still necessary for international stability. They're still necessary for security of at least some states. And that for all their traditional complaining about the lack of progress, most non-nuclear weapon states had come to at least tacitly accept the situation and accept that nuclear deterrence practices of nuclear weapon states are perfectly legitimate. And here the negotiation of the TPNW and its entry into force and the broad support among UN member states clearly contradict that narrative. They basically throw out the window the suggestion that in the NPT, sort of REFCON theatrics aside, everybody accepts that nuclear weapons kind of remain necessary for the time being. And that's very important, that you have an actual legally binding instrument that clearly challenges that until recently dominant narrative in the international regime. But of course, it follows that there is a certain tension between the two. And you know, if you have a treaty that is meant to be part of the regime, but is also a challenge to the status quo of the regime, it would follow that the relationship between the dominant, the central instrument of the regime and the new entrant is going to be tumultuous, at least in the beginning. And it certainly won't be as straightforward as, let's say, relationship between the CTBT and the NPT. And we'll see how it will play out in the coming NPT review meetings. I can't specifically forecast, but I think we've seen already that there's been quite a bit of anxiety about how the TPNW entry into force will affect the next NPT review conference and how much it will shape the debate on disarmament in particular, and whether it will be the biggest divisive issue. In this regard, I think it's important to underscore that the TPNW negotiators themselves chose to frame the treaty as supporting NPT implementation and work within the system. Even if they seek to shake it up, they're not out to destroy the existing system. And in the context of the upcoming 10th NPT review conference, the ban treaty supporters, we've heard, would at a minimum seek a factual acknowledgement of the treaty's entry into force and recognition of the importance of the humanitarian discourse in pursuit of nuclear disarmament. But importantly, the diplomats from key TPNW states have also repeatedly indicated that they do not seek to make the new treaty the centerpiece of disarmament debate in Main Committee 1 and Subsidiary Body 1, and that they would instead prefer to focus on the implementation of past commitments adopted by previous NPT review conferences. And you would think that nuclear weapon states and their allies who have been anxious about the impact of the TPNW and the NPT would seize on that opportunity, right? To keep the focus on decisions that were taken within the NPT review process itself. And so on the surface of it, it seems like it's a very workable arrangement to, acknowledge TPNW is there, acknowledge that we may have different opinions on it, and then go on working on specifics of past commitments and how do we take them forward. So that's kind of the ideal scenario, but it's not necessarily an easy one because it firmly kicks the ball back to the nuclear weapon states, right? It sort of puts the burden on them, rightly so, to demonstrate their commitment to implement those past decisions of the review conference and do so by putting something concrete on the table in terms of identifying priorities for the next review cycle, specific steps that they are planning to take, be it in arms reductions or in doctrine changes, in nuclear risk reduction activities, right? Because if there is nothing concrete in terms of past commitments implementation on the table to discuss, it is very natural that the discussion will get back to the TPNW and perhaps other issues. And so what concerns me is that there might be a temptation in some quarters to make the TPNW the centerpiece and sort of make that the reason that things fall apart. That would certainly help to mask the absence of concrete steps that nuclear weapon states are prepared to put on the table. I'm not saying that that's going to be the case, but I think there is certain risk of that. But the advent of the new US administration in the United States, their clearly different approach to multilateralism, their different approach to arms control, they give certain hope that they would take a different stance. They may not radically change their position on the TPNW. I wouldn't expect that, but I think the approach, the tone could very well change, and that bodes well, at least for the upcoming NPT review conference. And in the longer term, I think it would be, in a sense, a measure of success of the TPNW, how much it can, its very existence and the challenge it poses can put pressure, constructive pressure on the nuclear weapon states and allies to do more on the implementation of disarmament commitments they have already taken. If you argue for a step-by-step approach, you have to demonstrate that you're actually taking steps, because otherwise you're bankrupting the very approach that you are presenting as a viable alternative to the approach presented by the TPNW. And so it's not going to be an easy relationship, but it has a potential to be ultimately a more constructive one. I'll stop there. Thank you.
We'll hope for constructive, but thank you, Gaukhar. Before we start tackling some of the questions that came in, I want to first of all inform everybody who is listening to us today or watching on YouTube that we have somebody among the audience who I would really like to recognize. It's Ambassador Elayne Whyte, who presided the UN conference that negotiated the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. It's a daunting task. She had an extremely short time to do it, and literally 3 weeks or so during the negotiations themselves, and not that much in between. And I must say that her courage, professionalism, and passion, and I would even say sacrifice, are behind the successful negotiation of the treaty. Elena, I'm so delighted that you joined us today, and I would like to give you the microphone and congratulate you on this special occasion of the entry into force of the treaty.
Thank you very much, and good morning from Costa Rica. It's very nice to see you all. Of course, we are joyful, and we are so pleased that the treaty is advancing at a very good pace. And especially very pleased that we have completed this phase from negotiation to entry into force. As I said, at a very good pace. But we're also very eager and enthusiastic about this new phase in which we are going to start preparing for the first meeting of state parties under the fine leadership of Austria, the government of Austria, and of our dear Ambassador Kmentt. So we are in your hands and ready to support your endeavor. I know it's always this very strategic moment. Any treaty, the first 5 years of a treaty are the strategic ones. And this is the reason why it's so important that we learned from recent experiences that we have seen in other regimes, that we, in these 5 years, we need to think about what it is that we need to accomplish in the first meeting of state parties and the rest of meetings of state parties all the way up to the first review conference, and try to avoid, because of the way things are at this moment, try to avoid getting stuck in the administrative institutional discussions that actually have taken a lot of energy and political capital out of other regimes. So to be able to focus on the substantive discussion is going to be a very strategic aspect of the treaty at this moment. Another aspect that I would like to mention at this moment is that we cannot ignore that the treaty is entering into force in 2021. And 2021 is actually a transition year for the international system. We are coming out not only of a pandemic, not yet quite so out, but we are in the process of coming out of the pandemic, but also we are coming out of 4 years of a dynamic of undermining cooperation, dialogue, regimes, institutions. We have to acknowledge that we are aspiring to rebuild trust, dialogue, and to further strengthen the historic regimes and the new ones. So in this context, it is very important that we are very careful with each other. Every stakeholder needs to be careful in the way we address topics. We address different views and political narratives. And in the case of the TPNW, I think the narrative and political posturing of the opponents of the treaty need to be carefully thought through, because at this stage, what we need to make sure is that we take meaningful steps to strengthen global governance through cooperation and the rule of law and the respect of the rule of law. And there are some things that need to be taken into consideration vis-a-vis the position towards the TPNW. First of all, that it was born with a strong political force, because it is a solid majority of the international community that adopted the treaty. Second, the treaty regime has been promoted by responsible states that are in good standing with the non-proliferation obligations and that are concerned with upholding the international rule of law and with strengthening the culture of compliance with legal obligations across the architecture. And also, if you make a comparison with other topics of the international community of urgency, the TPNW, some sort of, we can say that represents a coalition of high ambition. All political processes need to move forward, such as the case of climate change, and the non-proliferation, arms control, and disarmament architecture also needs this high ambition coalition to be able to move things forward. And in this case, you can even think of the supporters of the TPNW as a high ambition coalition of countries that want to have higher ambition and faster implementation of the implementation of Article 6 of NPT. The second point I would like to, the other point I would like to make is that I am sure that TPNW will continue on the path of building on the positive interface between science and policy. Not only because it was the case of the movement of the humanitarian impact of nuclear weapons, but because it is the way that we do business in this time and age. As I said, as it is the case of also in climate change and other policy fields. And I am sure that this interface between science and policy will provide a very interesting opportunity for advisory from scientists and experts to contribute to the process of training, of education of officials, of creation of knowledge, but also of raising these strategic questions that need to be raised, such as the ones that we have heard this morning for Costa Rica, afternoon for you, to clarify the way in which all components of the architecture will interact with each other, because altogether we know that the international community has an overall objective, and that objective is to be able to build a world free of nuclear weapons, and to see how we build those cooperation and complementarity mechanisms and relationships in this new phase are going to be vital. And of course, experts and scientists are much welcome in this process. And again, Alexander, all the best to you, and we count on your fine leadership, and we are ready to support you in anything that we can be of help to you and to your leadership. So thank you, and good luck to you all.
Thank you, Elayne, and once again, congratulations on this big moment in history. Alexander, obviously no pressure on you, but there are a number of questions that came Q&A. I'm gonna group them a little bit and try to divide them among the participants. One, obviously, the question that many parties ask about the first meeting of the member states of the TPNW and what to expect from it, how the preparations for it's gonna go, and maybe something that I would ask Alexander to comment on. The second set of questions relates to the impact of the new US administration on the this whole debate on nuclear issues in relation to the TPNW and PT. And then the question among them, that kind of set of questions is specifically how the already announced intent to extend the New START treaty is going to impact the debate within the NPT, and also related question about the views from China and Russia on the treaty and their standing on that. Another set of questions that maybe I'll ask Gaukhar, but Heather, you also, and Alexander, welcome to chime in, relates to issues of verification in the treaty. I know that the treaty itself does not have much about the verification of specifics, but what could be done in the meantime. One specific question that I really like came from the audience is like how we the transparency could be built in based on the TPNW, particularly in the between the member states of the BAN Treaty and those who are non-signatories of the treaty. So I would stop here, and maybe I will start with the Alexander with you. You can pick up some other questions that I posed to you, to the panelists.
Yeah, thank you very much. Of course, it's very nice to see. Elayne. Greetings to Costa Rica. Yeah, on the first meeting of states parties, which as per the treaty has to take place within a year of entry into force, so until the 21st of 2022. The formal decisions still need to be taken. We've heard when the treaty was adopted, we suggested the meeting to be taking place in Vienna, and we've heard very positive feedback on this. Of course, all formal preparations for every meeting now are badly impacted by the pandemic, so it's very difficult, and this being a new treaty, that makes it even more difficult because lots of new aspects have to be developed. Of course, the Secretary General, as depository of the treaty, is already in the process of taking forward the formal preparations, communications to states parties, and so on. There are, of course, several substantive issues which have to be addressed by the treaty. There are timelines in Article 4. There are some of the interpretative questions that Heather talked about. They will certainly come up. Article 2 declarations have to be prepared. And then there are the positive obligations from victim assistance to environmental remediation. All of this has to be fleshed out, and states parties will come to the meeting with their expectations and their interpretations of these, what they intend to do, how they see the implementation of these aspects unfolding. There's, of course, universalization in Article 12, which is an obligation under the treaty, which is also an important aspect. So it's important that these the formal menu of the treaty is dealt with in a serious way and well prepared. And there again, the challenges of the pandemic. When will meetings be even possible? So probably quite a bit of the discussions will have to take place in informal setting, depending on what the opportunities are. So this is of course but these are challenges that we all face on all the treaties at the moment. So it's not different for the TPNW, with the added complication that it being a new treaty that makes it a little bit more complicated. I would say from my personal vantage point, it's extremely important that the preparation goes well, that states parties come to the meeting well prepared on the issues that they have to deal with. I think it's important for the treaty that this is done all very seriously, and I'm sure the states parties of the TPNW will approach it in that way. And also from my personal vantage point, I would say, given the very strong humanitarian underpinnings, the humanitarian rationale of the treaty, I would say it's also important that the meeting of states parties is, or maybe meetings round the meeting of states parties, but it's also a point where we not just talk about the sort of formal aspects of the treaty, but where the reason why we have this treaty is also put forward. So I would hope, and I'm pretty sure that TPNW states parties will see it that way, that it's also an opportunity to highlight the humanitarian consequences and risks of nuclear weapons again. And then, of course, the one important aspect is that it being a UN treaty, every UN member state will be invited to participate. So I think it's also an important question for non-signatories to make up their mind how they want to position themselves to this treaty. So I would hope that there will be a significant number of signatories who will want to be there and who will want to see what this treaty is all about. And I think it's something to be welcomed because, of course, ultimately the nuclear weapons issue can only be solved as an international community. So this will be an interesting year, and I think on the part of TPNW, states parties and signatories, the best thing is to just prepare seriously for this treaty and confident on the arguments on which it is built. Thank you. And maybe I've spoken too long, so I'm not touching the verification question. Maybe Gaukhar will handle this. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Alexander. Heather, how about I give you the microphone next?
Sure. Really great question. So thank you everyone for participating. So kind of three questions I'll tackle briefly. The first on the impact of the new administration. So I think we're already seeing that that the Biden administration is going to take a different attitude towards nuclear diplomacy by just what they've done already in terms of extending the START. I would expect to see something like a recommitment to the Prague agenda, as it's called, and what that entails. I would also expect to see some change in the rhetoric coming out of the U.S. about the TPNW. I would hope it would be a little bit softer, but we'll see. However, I do want to flag that this administration has been very clear, I think, in the campaign and the transition, that their top foreign policy priority is reestablishing credibility with allies. And so I think there will be some tension for them in that engagement with allies, such as, Poland, the Baltic states, Japan, South Korea, and how they rebuild that credibility, but also trying to advance an arms control and disarmament agenda. And that, when the rubber hits the road, so to speak, I think that's going to be a delicate balance. So while I think the administration probably will start off being quite ambitious, that might be tempered as we go along a little bit. In terms of the impact of New START extension on the NPT, obviously, I think this is going to be an improvement in atmospherics. And just kind of, as Ambassador Elayne Whyte had said, this is a moment of multilateralism, and hopefully that spills over into the NPT. But I also agree with Gaukhar that I do think the issue of past commitments is going to be the real challenge in terms of getting a final document. And while the new administration might take a different approach to past commitments from Trump, the Obama administration's position on past commitments wasn't that different from what we're seeing now. And I don't mean to say that, the Biden administration is just going to be, like Obama's third term. I don't think it is. I think it's going to be very different. But I do think that the issue of past commitments is still going to be the biggest challenge. And then finally on what do Russia and China think of this? We don't really know much about what they think of it, just because they haven't been getting the same type of pressure as the US and European states in terms of joining, or that normative pressure that Alexander spoke of. To be clear, I think I get it. They aren't exactly the liberal open democracies of some European countries. And so from a campaign perspective, it might be risky to try to build an ICANN in Beijing, for example. So I do get that. But nonetheless, if the TPNW's goal is to undermine nuclear deterrence, and specifically to target NATO's nuclear position, Russia probably loves the treaty, because that's kind of what Russia is trying to achieve as well, albeit by different means. And so again, this is something where now that the treaty has entered into force, I do hope that that universalization goal extends beyond Western democracies, and that we can start to get a bit more engagement with Russia and China on what their visions are for nuclear disarmament, because we haven't heard much about that either. But I'll stop there.
Thanks, Heather. And Gaukhar, to you.
Thank you everyone for great questions. I will, so transparency and verification, and I want to pick up a little bit on the China-Russia views on the treaty. They have actually pronounced themselves, perhaps not as aggressively as NATO has, but the statements have been a bit softer in recent months. And part of it is probably because they don't have to do the work that NATO is doing, antagonizing the TPNW, and so they can actually look good in comparison by saying softer things. I also think that genuinely Russia does not love the treaty, clearly, but they don't hate it as much as they thought they would before it was concluded. I think they expected the provisions of the treaty to be more far-reaching in terms of trying to universally ban nuclear weapons. They love repeating that this treaty is binding on its states parties. So they're prohibiting nuclear weapons for themselves. That doesn't concern us. So they clearly don't see the normative impact of the treaty with as much anxiety, perhaps, as US allies, as European allies. And that might well have to do with the susceptibility to domestic pressure, normative pressure, etc. But they have at least formally pronounced themselves on the treaty. On verification, so there are two articles in the TPNW dealing specifically with verification, Article 3 and Article 4, and I suggest that you, whoever asked the question, go and read those articles. Article 3 has to do with verification of key prohibitions on states that never had nuclear weapons. So non-nuclear weapon state joining the state that never had nuclear weapons joins the TPNW. The minimum requirement on it is to conclude a comprehensive safeguards agreement with the International Atomic Energy Agency. So the IAEA is named as an implementing agency there. And here the treaty simply took what's already been established by the NPT. Furthermore, it says if you have agreements going beyond the comprehensive safeguards, doesn't name the additional protocol, but clearly additional protocol is included in that. At the time of entry into force of the TPNW, you have to keep that as well. So whoever has comprehensive safeguards and additional protocol as of today, and they join the TPNW, they have to keep both comprehensive safeguards and the additional protocol. There's been a lot of criticism that, TPNW undermines the safeguards, it undermines verification, or some NATO leaflet said that there is no verification at the TPNW. That is not actually correct. So at a minimum, it requires the same safeguards that NPT does. And then there is a multi-point article for dealing with states that still have nuclear weapons at the time of their accession to the TPNW, or states that had possessed nuclear weapons but disarmed prior to joining the TPNW, and also states that had hosted nuclear weapons and then joined the TPNW. And there are no specific disarmament verification provisions. There are no specific prescriptions about how dismantlement of arsenals should be conducted, who is going to verify, by necessity, because none of the possessors actually participated in the negotiations. A lot of these details are left for future deliberation. So, and some of the obligations of states parties to the TPNW is to designate a competent authority with whom an acceding nuclear armed state would have to negotiate a disarmament plan. And another competent authority, it might be the same one, might be different, to conduct verification of the disarmament process. And one of the tasks for the very first meeting of states parties is actually to determine the deadline for disarmament of any given state, nuclear armed state that joins the treaty. And that's a serious requirement, right? Because there's no sign of any of the nuclear possessors joining anytime soon. So states will have to find a creative approach to how they define that kind of deadline. And rather than saying a specific number of years, they could say at the minimum or at the maximum or something. Something establishing sort of broader framework without foreclosing practically avenues. And on transparency, I think what Alexander said, that the treaty meetings are open basically to all UN member states, and a lot of the non-signatories would be expected to attend as observers. A number of them, I think, are considering that option. That in itself would establish certain transparency. Because it's a UN meeting, I imagine it's going to be webcast and there are going to be reports about it. I think it's a fairly will be a fairly open process that people can observe even without joining the treaty. I think I'll stop there.
Yeah, thank you, Gaukhar, much appreciated. There are a number of really interesting questions, but we're approaching the time of the end of the webinar. But maybe I'll quickly ask you to, in your concluding remarks, because I'll give you, each one of you, kind of a one minute for your last statements. One question that, it's a good question. It's like, so where we are in terms of we all talk about the normative strength and normative standing and everything of the treaty now, but is it already a customary norm of law? Where we are in that process? So maybe to clarify, because there are some good questions coming regarding that. And the other question to maybe address is how the TPNW is in relation to some other disarmament initiatives, NPT related or not. For example, comes to mind the Stockholm Initiative and some other issues. I know that there are many other good questions coming, but another question is regarding like, so is CTBT entry into force is still relevant or not? So many of these questions, if you want to touch on some of them or say some other points before we close the webinar, please feel free to tackle those. Alexander, maybe I'll give you the floor first for your final remarks.
I was hoping that you would give someone else the floor first, because I haven't really got closing remarks such on the customary international law issue. I think we've seen very clearly opponents of the treaty keep repeating their persistent objection. So there is the customary international law aspect, and I'm not an international lawyer as such, but I would say probably it's too early to call the TPNW customary international law. But as I said, I think opponents sort of look at universalization of the treaty and say it's not going to be effective because we're not going to join, so it cannot be universal. I think the universalization concept is a much broader one. So there is, of course, the strictly speaking legal one, which will be convincing as many states as possible to join the treaty, to make it legal for them. And then the number of countries that have joined the treaty will continue to grow, and will have signed the treaty and ratified the treaty will continue to grow. So that's one interpretation. That's one way of looking at universalization. But you also universalize the norm by every activity, including this webinar, by bringing the logic, the rationale of the treaty into the public discourse. So I would say universalization of the TPNW, if you consider the treaty as one aspect of a sort of normative lever for nuclear disarmament, universalization will be that every nuclear disarmament initiative in the future is probably to some extent, maybe fully, maybe partially, maybe to a small extent, also the result of the normative pressure, the universalization pressure that the TPNW has built. And I think that is extremely important, particularly in the coming years, where I agree it's probably unlikely that the nuclear armed states are going to join the treaty. But the rationale, the underlying rationale on which the TPNW is based, that pressure, that normative pressure, it's a normative and it's a political pressure. That's, I think, what is a key aspect of TPNW. Maybe I leave it at that. Thank you.
Thank you, Alexander. Heather?
Yeah, just very quickly, is it already a norm? No, I don't think it is. I also don't think it will be a norm until nuclear possessors, their allies, or states that rely on nuclear deterrence start joining the treaty. And that's just, you know, I'm not an international lawyer. I know a fair bit about how norms work, though, and unless you have uniquely affected states involved, where the norm starts applying to them, I really don't think that it's going to have that normative value until you get them involved. But just one thing to flag, I really agree with a lot of what Alexander is saying about the humanitarian impact angle here. I really do hope, and we've already seen it, how the treaty is raising awareness about humanitarian impact of nuclear weapons And I do think that that's a really great outcome of it. You know, that's how I met Alexander, and my kind of education on humanitarian impacts was really eye-opening. I think you can still rely on nuclear deterrence and be aware of those humanitarian impacts. But I do hope that it kind of sparks this renaissance in nuclear education in particular, where we aren't just talking about nuclear strategy and, you know, like throw weights, but we're also talking about what actually happens when one of these weapons goes off, because that has to be part of the discussion, is like a moral obligation. And that's something I really commend Alexander for, and I also commend VCDNP for, because you guys are doing so much on nuclear education. And so I do hope that that is an additional benefit that we can get out of this. Even if it doesn't necessarily become a norm, it has started an important conversation, or revived an important conversation.
You're muted, Elena.
Sorry, I'm muted. Gaukhar, thank you, Heather. Much appreciated. And Gaukhar, you're going to be the last one to round off the discussion today.
And I'll answer all the remaining questions.
Absolutely.
Just quickly, there's a question about Article 2 declarations and how they're verified, and that ties directly to the previous question. And the treaty doesn't make that link very specifically in words that you have to verify Article 2 declarations, but it's clear that, you know, if you declare you never had nuclear weapons, then Article 3 applies to you, and it's back to IAEA safeguards. And if you declare you had nuclear weapons or have nuclear weapons, then off you go to Article 4. So that's just a quick answer to that question. On the CTBT, that's a very interesting question. I think the entry into force of the CTBT is still relevant, but now I have an interesting situation where a treaty prohibiting all nuclear testing is in force, and it's not CTBT, it's TPNW. But TPNW doesn't have a definition of nuclear testing and doesn't have any verification attached to specifically nuclear testing. And so I think it would be important for the TPNW and CTBT to establish a relationship. And one of the things that states parties to the TPNW could do is specifically express support for the CTBT in their meetings, and kind of indicate that they consider CTBT important, not least because of the verification system it has, and that it's clearly the two treaties are both supportive and complementary to each other. I think it would be important to make that clear in the meetings of states parties. And finally, on the customary law and norms, again, not a lawyer here, but I think there's a bit of a distinction when we talk about norm as a standard of behavior and norm as a legal norm, all right, as a treaty that a state can join. And so we might be far from nuclear weapon states joining the TPNW in legal terms, but we could see much earlier than that how TPNW affects the standards of behavior, how nuclear possessors or nuclear reliant states themselves talk about nuclear weapons, how they justify continued reliance on nuclear deterrence, or how, you know, it can very well change the way they talk about it because of the humanitarian considerations and because of this recognition that growing number of states simply do not see nuclear deterrence as a legitimate instrument of security. And I think we'll see that impact way before we'll see them actually joining the treaty. Thank you.
Thank you, Gaukhar, and thank you all. You know, Heather, Alexander, Gaukhar, you were fabulous. It was, I think, a very good discussion, very kind of serious and substantive look at the treaty, the changes that it brought with the entry into force, relationship with the NPT and many other issues, and the way forward for it. I see some of the great responses to the panel, and thanking you for being a clear-eyed, as somebody put it in the notes. But with that, those of you who are interested to hear more about where we are with the CTBT and its entry into force, the VCDNP will have another kind of big event and discussion this week on the 28th. Visit our website if you want to hear more and register. But now, on behalf of everyone who listened and participated, you here through Zoom or on YouTube, thank you very much, and all the best to you, Alexander, many kind of best wishes for your daunting task. And Elayne, again, and Alexander and everyone, congratulations on the entry into force of the treaty. And all the best to everyone. Stay safe and healthy.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.